Today I'm going to be talking about a literature review paper that we're working on, where we're trying to learn what behavioral insights we can use to improve the design of agri-environmental programs. So I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators on this paper. Nick Janish is the lead author. He's at the California Energy Commission. And then we have Kent Messer and Paul Ferraro, who are in the room, who are also co-authors on this paper. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to be here 3 weeks ago when Paul talked, but I did tune in via webinar. And I thought it was a great talk. He really kind of, for those of you who weren't here, he highlighted some of the methodological advancements that we really need to be thinking about in order to improve the work that we do and kind of increase the rigor with which we think about identifying the treatment effects for these behavioral insights that I'll be talking about. So I thought that was a great presentation. Paul's also a hard act to follow, so I hope that this presentation will kind of dovetail neatly into what he was talking about last week, and I'll be actually kind of presenting a framework in which we can start identifying the exact types of behavioral insights that we want to do more research on, and we'll be also summarizing the knowledge that we have right now. So before I jump into the paper, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge CBEAR. Most of you may be already aware of the mission of CBEAR, but for those of you who are less familiar with CBEAR, I encourage you to check out the website, centerbear.org. What I've really enjoyed about being involved with CBEAR is that the group of researchers who engaged with the center are really trying to foster a kind of culture of experimentation and how we think about the programs and policies that relate to agriculture and the environment. So I think they've done a really nice job at facilitating collaborations among program administrators and researchers to develop this network in which we can work together to try to find ways to improve how these programs are functioning. So yes, we've really appreciated a lot of support from ERS and also from NIFA. I'll make just one more comment and talk about the fact that we had a conference in the fall. Paul mentioned this in his talk a bit, which we were really trying to understand, well, first of all, we learned a lot about some novel new research that's being conducted, and then also discussed a lot about how we can improve the research moving forward. And that's really what Paul's talk was about last week, and that's available on YouTube if you didn't get to catch it the first time around. I just wanted to highlight two pieces or kind of two takeaway messages that really resonated with me after attending this conference. The first was how we think about the design stage of our research and trying to be really kind of careful with how we plan and think about our treatments and the randomization that we use to assign treatments to different groups, particularly when we're working across counties or states or regions, to really think about our identification strategy and to conduct power analyses in order to make sure that we have a sample size that is sufficient to identify effects that are there, but also not overestimate those impacts. And then to use a peer review process when we're thinking about our designs. The second takeaway was a conversation, kind of an ongoing conversation about how we think about creating hypotheses as a research question. Again, Paul mentioned last week about registering hypotheses beforehand in order to help us be more cautious about doing a lot of ex post multiple comparison tests to see what the data is going to tell us after the fact. And also to be really careful when we're thinking about our questions to identify ones that are more causal versus predictive. So these were takeaways that resonated with me. And earlier this week, we actually had one of our lab members at the University of Delaware give us an educational talk about how to manage a research portfolio. And he provided this quote. It says, "We need to slow down in order to go fast." And I've just been thinking about that one day. Because, my first thought that popped into my head when we started really talking about peer review designs, oh man, do I have time to go through a peer review process when I'm in the designing stage of my research?
Mark off
And of course, the correct response would have been, yes, of course, I need to make time to go through a rigorous peer review in the design. So I just thought that, this is something I'm going to try to incorporate in how I think about my own research planning. And I think it's going to allow us to be more rigorous and careful with how we design our research. And I wanted to attribute the quote to someone, but through a Google search, no one could agree on who actually said it. Pretty sure it was someone smart, but I'm not sure on that. But this really has stuck with me. Okay, now jumping into this literature. Just take a few moments to motivate the need for this paper, because there may be many of you sitting there thinking, we already know a lot about, kind of these insights from behavioral economics.
Yeah, so
why do we need a paper that's really just focused on agri-environmental applications, right? And so you're right, we do know a lot more than
a joint distribution
years ago, or even 20 years ago, because behavioral economics and these insights from psychology and other social sciences have really been kind of infiltrating mainstream economic thought, right? And so we know that we can alter programs, right, in ways in which we can have some kind of predictable behavioral changes. And these can often be cost effective if we're thinking about the perspective of an agency, right? And so we see successful examples in health and education, finance, and many of you in this room have done work, particularly looking at how we can use behavioral nudges to conserve resources, energy, and water. So we've seen a lot of successes. And we've also had examples, which I'll talk about today, in the agri-environmental realm. But I'm going to argue the reason we can't just take the lessons that we've learned here and immediately apply them is because we really need to know if the behavior that we see from consumers and homeowners is really going to transfer and translate when we start talking about producers, which are a very kind of unique group. And we're going to talk about today some of the challenges in designing programs to try to think about motivating behavioral change with agricultural producers.
X1 and X2, right?
All right. So before I give you the punchline and start talking about how I think these insights can be used in agri-environmental program design, I'm going to take a step back just for a moment and make sure we're all on the same page about the type of programs that I'm going to be talking about. Today, I'm going to be really focusing on how we can use these insights to alter voluntary programs, right? So these programs let's see if I have a pointer here. Yeah. These programs in which we are wanting to design cost-effective incentives and use technical assistance in order to motivate these agricultural management changes that provide us with some sort of improvements in the environment, right? And so U.S. Department of Agriculture is a leader in the United States in doing that. Annually, conservation program spending is at over $5.5 billion, right? And so trying to think about how we can use this money in a way that's cost effective and allows us to achieve the most environmental improvements for those limited budgets is important. And so that's what I'll be talking about. All right. So why is this tough? Well, I'm going to give you a list, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details, different bullet points. Many of you will recognize the probably research that you've been working on for maybe most of your career. But I think it all comes back to the idea that we do rely on voluntary programs. So getting participation, not only adequate participation, but getting participation from the right people is really key and it's a challenge. Okay? So what makes it challenging? Well, we know we have heterogeneity among farmers and among farmland, right?
Let's call this
There's information asymmetries, so there's information about costs and benefits for the farmer that the agency doesn't know. There are things that the farmer doesn't know, particularly about maybe the goals of the agency or the benefits that their actions will be able to provide. We have a disproportionality of pollution, which means there are some farms that we really need to engage, right? These farmers that manage this land, we really want to engage because they're having a big impact on something like water quality, but targeting is really challenging. We want to know that our funds are getting additional for environmental improvements. Might be concerned about transaction costs and how that might limit participation. Farmers have different information sources. Who do they trust? Where are they getting information and what motivates them in order to think about changing management, which is easier said than done, right? And then all of the interesting dynamics involved with land tenure and thinking about who owns the land versus who's operating the land, which is changing and continues to change as we see more and more land that's owned by someone who's not actually the farmer.
Right.
I'm sure you're noticing a lot of your own research up here in this list, but I don't want to be overwhelm anyone here. I think still it all kind of comes back to the idea that we do have these challenges. We are relying a lot on voluntary programs, so it creates a really interesting kind of setting in which we're working and how we need to think about how programs are designed.
There you go. All right, thank you.
Okay. Can you pause quickly? Sure. If you're joining in online, please mute yourself. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so jumping into the paper, what did we do, right? Well, we reviewed the experimental literature looking for these kind of behavioral insights within the agri-environmental domain, all right? And I'm also going to mention, we did look outside of the agri-environmental domain, and I'll talk briefly some about those types of papers, but we really wanted to focus on trying to assess the kind of stock of knowledge that we have specifically focused on agriculture and the environment. All right, we categorized these behavioral insights and also presented effect sizes for these different behavioral treatments. And I think this is one of the more valuable parts, actually, of the work that we've been doing. So I'm going to talk more about that in a moment, and I hope that you will also find value in that effort. So wait just a moment to give more details. All right, so hopefully I've already convinced you that yes, we know a lot, but we don't know enough. That's the need for this paper. We don't want to just apply lessons outside of this field and then assume they're going to work when we start doing this and thinking about farmer behavior. Okay. So I'm going to break all of the rules of a good presentation, right? You're supposed to limit yourself to 7 key points, right? Well, we're using a framework that's called Linespace that was presented in the Journal of Economic Psychology in 2012, and Linespace has 9 letters. So immediately I've broken the rules. So I hope you can stick with me. I agree that it gets a little long when we get to the 8th and the 9th point, but I'll try to keep it all relevant and bring in a lot of examples. Stop me if it's ever too fast or you feel like you want some more information about one of these points. But basically the idea here is that these authors, they categorized insights into these 9 different bins, okay, and they call them cues, behavioral cues. And using these cues, we want to alter behavior and think about what kind of behavior we would predict based on the cue that we're providing. And I'm not going to step through them all right here in this slide because I have a slide for each. So don't worry if you haven't read through the whole thing, you'll get each one in turn. First, before I jump into the framework itself, I want to tell you how we decided which studies we would include, right, in this analysis. We had a set of criteria. We said the study needed to test the effect of one or more behavioral nudge, needed to be motivated by an agri-environmental challenge, needed to have economic content and consequences, and be analyzing revealed behaviors, right, that are made in response to salient costs and benefits. So we did not consider stated preference studies, right? Did it have to be published? This has been challenging. For those of you who are working in this field, you know that there is a lot of work going on right now, right? ERS and NIFA have funded work in the last couple years. CBEAR had a mini grant program 3 years ago that's funded a lot of really interesting studies related to this. But as we know, as economists, 3 years really isn't long enough to do the research and get it through the peer review process. So there's a lot of great working papers right now. So I wasn't very strict about the papers needing to be published. I am going to talk about working papers, and you all can let me know at the end if you think I need to be a little more strict or if I need to kind of relax some of these criteria. Another thing we did is we kind of subdivided the papers into papers that were focused on producer behavior and consumer behavior. I haven't talked about consumer behavior so far, and I'm not going to start talking about it for the rest of the presentation. The basic idea here was that consumer preferences could motivate behavioral change from farmers if they're trying to produce in a way to produce for a certain new demand, right, of consumers. Maybe consumers want products that are produced more sustainably or that protect water quality, right? But for now in this talk, I'm not gonna go into that part of the research. Now, even within the producer behavior, we also noted whether the study focused on management of working lands, so productive agricultural lands, or preservation, like land retirement or habitat preservation. So I put this slide up here only to emphasize that we considered papers using many different types of experiments, all the way from laboratory experiments with students to these administrative field experiments in which researchers worked with program administrators to embed treatments in existing programs. Okay, so we included all of these in the study. All right, and I told you that one of our contributions is that we, in addition to classifying the study in these categories, we also estimated or reported, excuse me, the standardized effect sizes. Right, so we did that by looking at the estimated treatment effect and dividing that by the standard deviation of the outcome variable and the control group. And this allowed us to talk about these effect sizes and these normalized units, so we could talk about the direction and the magnitude of the expected treatment effect. Okay? And we hope that this will be really valuable for researchers as they conduct power analyses for new studies, right? That they will have this kind of, this great, like a database to go and find a similar study and see the treatment effects that were reported. Okay. I'll quickly note that we found many of the studies didn't present enough information for us to actually report the standardized treatment effects, right? So I'm encouraging everyone I talk to now that's doing this kind of work to please report that, particularly the standard deviation of the outcome variable for the control group. It's often left out of the published paper. All right, so let's jump in. First, oh yes.
About how we study contingency.
Yes, great question. Okay, so and this is where I'd love some feedback because this is ongoing work. Right now, based on those criteria we set up, which excludes all of the mechanism design work, and I'm going to mention that again in a moment, we have 14 studies. It's not a lot of studies, right? So there's possibility, and I think I should say more than a possibility, I feel like I am leaving out a lot of crucial lessons that we have from the literature based on the criteria that we're using right now. So I'd be very curious to know your perspective on that. And at the end, after I kind of go through each of these cues, I'll show you the table that categorizes them into their different bins. Okay, so with Messenger, we know that people receive and respond to information differently depending upon who presents that information to them. Right? So I found a lot of really interesting work out of this group in the UK called the Countryside and Community Research Institute, talking about how we can craft messages, use messengers to build credibility and localize the knowledge and really motivate action. But most of these were case studies, right? They weren't controlled experiments where you're really trying to measure these causal relationships, these causal effects, right? So when I looked to the literature, the agri-environmental literature for those types of studies, really identified two. These are laboratory studies with students. They're quite unique, as you can see here. We actually, this was work that was done at the University of Delaware, and we did a non-point source pollution laboratory experiment in which students were given feedback about polluting behavior from their familiar school mascot, UD, over here on the right, and from this unfamiliar kind of mascot named Malloy, who's actually a leopard grouper, if you're wondering what that is. And we found that actually in the lab, they reduced pollution when UD would be sad, right, about a pollution outcome, even in the laboratory. This research was extended, and another student looked at the response to feedback from university peers, from other students at the university, and found a similar effect. Now, of course, we're not proposing that a mascot runs out to every farm, but you can probably think of mascots that actually impact your actions, perhaps. Smokey the Bear jumps to mind for me. You know, his message that I'm the only one who can prevent forest fires has been ingrained in me since I was very small, right? Maybe we can think more about doing that. Of course, let's step beyond mascots. That was just the example I'm showing. And we could think about the messages that come from peers, input suppliers, extension, program managers. We need more research understanding how that information is received, right? And I think this is particularly important in thinking about how to communicate information that might be controversial, right? Maybe we need to have a conversation about climate change or a program that's really unpopular, right? And thinking about how we can use messengers to convey that. Okay, the next is incentives. There's a lot of economists here. I think we're all pretty comfortable with the claim that incentives can change behavior. That's why I'm an economist, actually, because I thought that was just fascinating when I was an undergraduate student. Okay, but here we're actually not just looking at comparing having incentives versus not having incentives, and we actually exclude the kind of more classic mechanism design literature. Instead, we focus on the characteristics of incentives and the delivery of incentives and how those kind of impact behavior, right? So in the Dolan et al. Paper, there's a lot to unpack within the incentives category. I don't have time to unpack all of that right now. I'm going to focus on this last one, which is that we kind of live for today, and so we have this present bias, right? And we want our payments today instead of waiting for until the future. So I'm going to focus on that with a few examples. But also, you're probably familiar with these other kind of points as well. That reference points matter. That we have loss aversion. Most of us are more loss averse. We can overweight small probabilities of events, and we often kind of allocate money into these mental accounts that we keep track of. Right? And so maybe if we were going to move away from the voluntary program arena, we could start thinking about how we could use insights about loss aversion, right? I've started thinking about this differently and how we can kind of think differently about conservation compliance rules, right? And how they could actually be tied to water quality outcomes. Right? That's another paper though, so we're not going to go into details today. But for number 5, I think there's some real applications. And some of this work comes out of folks, is work that you all have done here at ERS, right? So because we know that there is this present bias, it might impact decisions we make about the timing of conservation payments, right? So Duquette et al. In 2012 did a really interesting administrative field experiment with the American Farmland Trust, which gave farmers some options about how they would receive conservation payments. Right, $400 today or more than $400 in the future. They actually found that farmers had an average discount rate of 34%, much larger, right, than most of the discount rates we talk about when we teach the subject, and we're talking about 3 or 5%, right? So the timing of payments could increase participation, could also decrease costs. And this finding has also popped up in some of the literature, including a study on tree planting in Uganda, and then studies on Costa Rica's reforestation program, and showing that actually that people that do have more of that present bias and discount rates, are more willing to participate when the payments are front-loaded. So when a big chunk of that payment is coming in year one, instead of dividing it out evenly or uniformly over a number of years. Okay. So the next is norms. So we've seen a lot of evidence that norms can impact behavior, and a lot of this work has been done in the kind of energy conservation literature and water conservation literature. Paul's done a lot of the work on the energy conservation side of things. So we don't see as many controlled studies thinking about this in the agri-environmental domain. We do have a nice one. This is a lab experiment by Banerjee and co-authors, in which they show that getting information about neighbors can improve the environmental efficiency of a land conservation program in a lab setting. Critically, part of the goal of the program was to have contiguous habitat, right? So that would make sense that additional information could assist with coordination. So maybe not exactly the kind of norm effect that we would be traditionally thinking about, but we did see an improvement in outcomes there. So last year, there you go, and Paul and I think Nate Higgins was on this paper as well, published a paper in AJAE looking at CRP sign-up. Right, and they had a few treatments here. Some farmers just got reminders to sign up for the CRP. Others got this reminder, which was information in addition to a social norm treatment, in which they got information about other farmers near them. And they didn't find an effect between the information and the norm. They did find a positive effect of the information itself, the reminder itself. Okay. So I think there's still a lot of interesting questions here, particularly related to what kind of information are we providing and who should that information be about, right, within a community? Who do farmers care to learn about, and what will actually influence their own behavior? Okay, so I won't spend too much time on defaults because I know this was in the talk 3 weeks ago, because there's been a lot of, several studies that CBEAR has worked on. These were the AgVise and HomeVise studies that Paul mentioned. But they found that just by changing a default bid, right, the bid represented a cost share, right, the amount of money that an individual would be willing to pay in order to do a conservation practice. Just changing that default bid influenced their final bid, right? So looking at a study in agriculture, they found that starting the default bid at 100%, meaning that the farmer was willing to contribute 100%, actually increased the average bid by 10 percentage points. Okay? And then in a study with residents, so homeowners, they found that every dollar that you increase the bid, then the default bid, you could increase the final bid by 19 cents. So some really interesting work there. All right. With salience, we know that our attention is drawn to things that seem novel and really relevant to us, right? That this matters to me as an individual. It's not just general information that's being provided. Although the Wallander et al. Study was not probably technically a controlled test of salience, I thought that how they presented the information really did make it more salient for participants by really highlighting that, you know, this many farms in your state have enrolled, right? Let's really show that this is a program for you and your neighbors are participating in it. I thought that helped with salience, but I didn't find studies that really tried to tease out salience itself and measure the effect of that cue. I will note, though, that we have some evidence that too much information and trying to make things maybe too salient by putting, you know, a lot of information out there can increase rent-seeking, though, right? Work has been done by Tim Kaysen and Shamanti Banerjee, and seeing that when you provide information about the benefits that can be provided by an action, people realize that they are potentially more valuable to the agency or the administrator, and they try to get higher levels of payment. And so that's just something I thought we could keep in mind, right, as we're talking about this cue. Okay, we're on the P now of mind space, right? We're getting close. There's a lot of them. So here we have priming, right? We know that we respond to subconscious cues all of the time. And for me, when I think about priming, an example of an experiment that could be run would be if we're trying to do something that enhances soil health, so providing an image like this where someone's tending to the soil or really valuing something growing out of the soil, would it influence behavior and maybe encourage them to participate in a program, maybe a cover crop program that was going to increase soil health? Now, I couldn't find studies that use kind of imagery or more subconscious cues. But again, if we think about priming a slightly different way, we do have priming that's happening here in work that's come out of this group, right? We have priming in the CRP sign-up reminder letter because it's priming people that, they're going to have an opportunity to sign up. So they should, keep that in mind, and this should be kind of in the front of their mind when they're thinking about planning. Also, Nate Higgins and some colleagues tested the effect of using reminder postcards to vote in FSA county elections, right? But this kind of priming, right, the idea of reminding people, it's a little different than how Dolan and his co-authors are talking about priming with more subconscious cues. Okay, so I will note that differentiation. Okay, with affect, it's this idea that our emotions, right, they really powerfully shape what we do. Okay, so certain words, events, how we frame information to make it more emotional, right, or tug at your heartstrings can really change your behavior. I think this is a really neat experiment that was conducted by Kent Mester and Allison Borchers. And what they were doing here, this was a kind of a framed field experiment done with individuals at an event in Delaware. But in the paper, they relate this to land preservation and decisions that are made about which pieces of land that you are willing to preserve. And so here, people were picking between two bundles of wine. Both had a value of $100, but one had 4 bottles of $25 wine, the other just a single bottle of $100 wine. So when they asked people just to choose which bundle they wanted, people were choosing the bundle of 4 bottles. Okay. But then using a between subject design, some of the participants were told that they could pick which bundle they wanted, but the other bundle would be destroyed right in front of them. They had the hammer there if this really happened. Smash the bottle or the bottles, right, depending upon the bundle. And when there was that threat of destruction, people chose option A, the $100 bottle, right? They switched, well, it wasn't the same people, they didn't really switch, but that group of people chose this $100 bottle more frequently. Okay, just because of this threat that valuable thing would be destroyed right in front of their eyes. And in the paper, it's really nice, it's in Economic Letters, it was published in 2015, but they talk about how that could relate to land preservation and trying to preserve kind of environmentally valuable parcels. So it's kind of a neat example. In another laboratory experiment, they found that when they used empathy framing, then that made a big difference and really influenced people's decisions about pollution abatement, and they abated more when there was an empathy frame versus a frame in which they talked about that individual person's private benefits. Okay? So another example of how you could use affect to change behavior. All right, with commitment, so I find this really interesting, and actually, we have commitment, and then the last one is ego. And for me, these are hard to tease apart sometimes because by committing to something, you could also be talking about your own identity and what you're willing to do. So in a minute, I'm going to kind of tell you about some new articles that I just found in my Delaware Farmer that have to relate to this, and specifically how the willingness of farmers to engage in these certification programs. But first of all, just define it. So the idea here is that we seek to be consistent with our public promises. That's the idea of commitment. So it will change our behavior, but it can even change our self-identity by making that commitment, because all of a sudden then we kind of want to align ourselves with what we just committed to. We can be more willing to conform, and then it can also generate a positive attitude towards the thing we said we would do, because again, we want to feel good about it. Right? So there's some interesting things that can happen. So we could use this as a nudge by asking producers to publicly make these commitments. And in a study in the Netherlands, Lockhorst and colleagues, they found that Dutch farmers that made this public commitment regarding conservation stated a greater desire to engage in unsubsidized conservation. So they weren't requiring the kind of cost shares or the subsidies. Note the word stated there. The public commitments were real, but they didn't measure changes in participation in a program. They then, after the people made these public commitments, they did a survey, right, and asked them what they would be willing to do moving forward, right? So we don't have a good measure of what they actually did. But this made me start thinking about many of the certification programs that we have. Right, this one is from Maryland. It's the Farm Stewardship Certification and Assessment Program. Get the recognition you deserve, right? So this, to me, again, this is where I'm saying I kind of blur commitment into identity, because I think they're very connected. But why do we need more research and kind of targeted research to really tease out why people are participating? Well, I know you probably can't read this, but let's take a look at some of the benefits that you're going to get as a farmer. You do get recognized. You do get, it says a handsome metal sign for, for your farm, right? Receive recognition on the website. But also there's this one up here. You get a 3-year waiver from MDA nutrient management inspection. So we don't really know, is it the recognition? Is it the waiver? Is it other benefits they may get? I think this is why we really need to think more carefully about how we can actually design research and design experiments to try to tease out some of these effects. This is another one that I'm quite familiar with in Michigan, the MEAP program, Michigan Agricultural Environmental Assurance Program. So again, they provide this sign. There's a lot of recognition of you and your family. As a farming family, this can mean a lot. But there's also some other benefits. They get some protection and some assurance that they'll be grandfathered in certain ways with changing kind of regulatory oversight, perhaps. There's some additional small benefits related to insurance, but I think those are pretty moderate. But then there's been some survey research trying to tease out what was the real reason that farmers are participating, and it's pointed somewhat to a feeling that if you participate and show that you are doing your part, that people are going to work with you. They're going to kind of be more understanding as that kind of maybe regulatory landscape changes, right? Because you've demonstrated you're committed to this. Okay, so the last part of the Linespace framework is ego, and I put with that identity. We act in ways that make us feel better about ourselves. I think we also want to act in ways that align with who we think we are, right, deep down. So people could be motivated, again, by feeling like they're doing something that's good and they're proud of and that aligns with their own personal beliefs. So again, I think that's where some of these programs come up. These articles that came out, I've really gotten good use out of the Delmarva Farmer publication. I don't know if anyone reads it.
I read it online.
Yeah, I love also getting like a newspaper, and now I kind of feel like my grandmother when I cut things out. But these farmers didn't know that I would be cutting out their pictures. But every time I see a farmer get an award, I cut out the picture, right, and I save it because I'm just in awe with how much recognition is being provided, and I think it's fabulous, right? There's recognition for getting the certification. There's recognition. I think I have another photo here. Oh, where'd my pointer go? Right, of there's the Delaware Environmental Steward Awards. This is an older photo, but we're still doing it. We had it get awards again in 2018. So I think that really ties in with some of the things we're talking about, but we haven't studied them really rigorously with experimental methods. So, you know, is there a way to do that? Is there a way to try to design research to see what effect these programs really have? I think that's an important question kind of moving forward and thinking about what is really motivating the action. Because there's a lot of things tied in here. Right? All right, so this is the table when we kind of start categorizing these different experiments. And you probably already could tell during my presentation that many of the studies kind of are overlap, right? They count for different types of these cues because it's hard to tease apart exactly what was motivating the behavior. Was it the salience or was it the comparison to peers, right? Well, the comparison might have made the information more salient to you. So sometimes it's really hard to figure out exactly what motivated behavior. So in saying that, I'll pose a question to you to think about for the next few minutes. Is it the right framework to use? Should we be using the Linespace framework? Is there another more streamlined way to think about behavior and how we can use behavioral insights to motivate a behavioral change of producers? I think, you know, that's something that we continue to reflect upon as we move forward with this study in particular in this review. You'll notice a few things that just the little spots are blank, right? We have commitment here, not because economists haven't thought about commitment or studied commitment, but it's just finding a study that, you know, passes all these different criteria that can be included here. So maybe the criteria, thank you, can be adjusted a little bit to be more inclusive about the true body of knowledge that we have about some of these issues. All right, so a few takeaways, and I think I know some of you might have to sneak out in 2 minutes, but I think despite having a lot of behavioral insights in other contexts, we need more and we need really robust and rigorous findings from research in the agri-environmental domain. But you know, I think there's an opportunity too. I think there could be some low-hanging fruit, perhaps particularly with interventions that have proven to be very successful in other fields, right? So we could think about how norms have been communicated to motivate energy conservation, and we could think about how could we test that in an agri-environmental program. Okay, I already kind of emphasized how much, you know, I'm starting to think about really careful design and getting peer reviewed and trying to be very deliberate. You know, not that we don't try to be that way all the time, but I think it's easy to feel excited about getting data and to really want to kind of move quickly through a design stage when that's quite possibly the most important stage of any of these studies, right? So I think that there's a real opportunity for us to think about the points that Paul made last week and think about, you know, what can we do to really improve the methods that we're using. All right, so I want to make sure I mention again that Kent will be talking in 3 weeks from today, and he's going to be talking about some of the challenges and the lessons that have been learned through a lot of the work that's been conducted through CBEAR and through colleagues here at ERS and beyond. So I think that will be a great talk as well. I'd be happy to get questions or feedback. That would be fun. All right, thank you.
We can take some questions here and some later if you'd like to talk to Leah first.
It was mentioned earlier that about size effects on the 14 studies. Do you have some summary estimates of what the
and I debated whether I should present them. The reason that I decided not to include a slide is because there are so many gaps. I could provide our full appendix to anyone who's interested that shows every study for which we were able to report the estimated treatment effects. We have a lot of laboratory studies included in the review, and a lot of those show very large effect sizes. So ranging from some of them, 0.5 up to 1.25, right? They just effect sizes that are huge. We have the field studies, they're around 0.03 to 0.16, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. But I could provide you a catalog of those. I looked to see if I saw big differences across the different cues, but what I was finding that there are so many overlaps with studies throughout the framework that there weren't big differences in the range of the estimated effect sizes for the different cues. So I just didn't find it to be a very, I didn't feel very comfortable kind of saying this is exactly what the effect sizes are for research that's, analyzing these different insights. But yeah, good question.
So when I was looking at your Linespace table, I was sort of thinking, well, it'd be nice to know, as someone who isn't an experimentalist, what level of activity there is in the rural sociology community here. Some of the people who are doing more qualitative work on these topics, we might not be measuring it or working with the data in the same way that we are. And so I wondered if you had any thoughts about, okay, so we only have studies that fit our framework. We have this number of studies, but there's a lot of activity going on in this community in this space. And whether you all are cataloging that as you come across papers that might not fit your criteria.
So what we've done in the review so far is we've talked about papers that don't fit within the criteria, but we feel are informative, but we don't include, so two things. We talk about them if they don't fit the criteria. We don't include them in that table that I showed you. If they did fit within the criteria, except they weren't agri-environmental, we report the effect size in the appendix. But I completely agree with you that this is something I'm struggling with as I look at the literature. The study I told you about with some thinking about why farmers participate in MEAP was done by a rural sociologist. I think it's really informative. It's a great study. I don't feel comfortable with not acknowledging it. But right, as we've set up the framework and thinking about testing kind of these causal impacts, it doesn't meet the bar that it would take to be included. So.
Something I was thinking about is all the effects that you're going down this list, kind of what is the potential ability to draw new people into the program from the effects, and what is the potential to increase the usage of the program from an effect? So let's say you want to do something about awards, the effect awards. Is that something that's going to be more useful in increasing enrollment, or is that going to be more useful in getting current programs to shift their behavior? Yeah, something like that would be pretty useful in terms of thinking about prioritizing which of these affects behavioral things to try and test the different contexts.
I'm really glad you asked that, because I kind of failed to wrap back around to the introduction when I talked about the challenges with agri-environmental policy design, but I think it hits at exactly your point. We're facing all of these challenges, and maybe there's some farms that we really need to engage that aren't currently engaged. And so my understanding of your question is, what will we be doing in order to engage maybe new farms versus just enhance participation from kind of groups that are already rather engaged in these kinds of efforts? I don't know if I can give you a great answer to that question. I've been thinking about norms, right, and how you could try to encourage people that aren't participating by providing information about others in their community. Your question about the awards is not sure. I'm not sure if the award itself and trying to align with maybe one's ego or identity is enough to bring additional people in that have chosen not to participate, because sometimes, I don't know this at all. I wonder, maybe their identity doesn't align with that identity, in which case we wouldn't be very effective in trying to think we'd motivate change by offering the award. So that's just, I think it's a great question. I think it's something we should dig into more, and I'm going to make a note of that, because I think that's something where we can maybe add value in thinking about the framework. Thank you.
There was, when you're looking at behavior, one of the things that made me uneasy about looking at program participation and incentives was that there's a colleague who works for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and he told me his experience when he's trying to get farmers enrolled in a program that requires wetlands is that in some cases you go and farmers are receptive. In other cases, they want to shoot you because you're a federal employee.
Right.
So I don't know to what extent that also affects USDA programs, but if you're looking at people's decisions on program participation based on participation, then you may be leaving a large portion of the farming population out of your analysis.
That's certainly a good point. Do you think that relates at all to kind of the messengers that we're using to communicate information? Because that's something that's jumping into my head now and thinking about how we approach farmers in these different groups. Obviously, in your example, the approach really wasn't working for this particular subsection or of the community.
Yeah, I mean that came to my mind, and that would be a particularly big challenge you might have.
Oh, sorry.
I think I definitely, yeah.
You know, as to your 9 points, I'm not a behavioral economist, and I'm thinking about the econometric sort of. Do you think you can identify best practice in your sample, like 9 criteria? So 9 criteria.
So these are the 9 criteria I showed in the framework.
I mean, can you identify or estimate best practice among? Yes.
You're saying, could we use maybe existing data to think about that?
Exactly, you know, because I mean, I know this is a literature review, but do you think that would be a useful exercise to try to identify the best practice? Do you understand my question?
I think I understand what you're asking. I think it would be extremely challenging to think about the effect of these different kind of behavioral cues, because very few studies really try to understand kind of these types of motivations in affecting behavior. I think that's one of the benefits of trying to promote more experimental approaches. You know, even within agencies like the U.S. Department of Agriculture, if we could design an experiment that had carefully defined kind of treatment groups, so that we could actually identify a causal effect through that design and that randomization, I think that we would have more success and more confidence in attributing a behavior that we see to a particular cue. I'm not saying there's no data out there, but I would struggle to think that there's a lot of data that would allow us to really work through the whole framework with one study. So, yeah, I don't know if my other colleagues have another comment on that.
That'd be a really compelling thing to do, right?
Yeah.
That'd be really, and then the other thing you want to overlay it is the cost of them, right? Some things may be a lot more costly if we were discussing phone calls or something like that, that could be helping, nudge people along, but could be really expensive. Other things could, like, a change in default could be relatively cheap. So, and that's why we often think about these nudges at all, is that their cost effectiveness, right? They might not change things dramatically, but a bang for your buck could be, very effective. So, having, I don't think we certainly haven't gotten to the idea of what these cost to implement
right.
in a level, but that's good. A compelling reason why more research in this area could answer some really important questions and give people who are trying to think about, well, do I use a normative message, or do I use something else? Which is, where should I start first?
And then actually, I want to come back to your question for a minute, because I may have misunderstood it. Are you thinking about doing a meta-analysis of the study?
Well, because when you were talking about the different behaviors that were desirable behaviors, I have to think about, is there like a group of farmers, or farmer, or 2 or 3 that you can identify as best practice among, is there a study that has done that? A meta-analysis, that's what I was thinking first, but then I was thinking.
And then I told you we had 14 studies. I don't know, we're going to do a great meta-analysis there.
Yeah.
I appreciate the comment. I'm going to give that some thought.
I have a comment from online back in regards to the discussion on the messenger effect. And they were just mentioning that if people identify USDA with interference in their choices, you might want to reject that it's the messenger simply because it also represents intrusiveness.
Okay. So the association with the different messengers and other impacts. Yeah, we're breaking out and adding even more kind of cues in here. Maybe that's an attribute or I could think of that as an attribute or a characteristic of that particular messenger that perhaps you would have to then ask and try to understand the perception of that messenger, and that could perhaps inform some of that type of analysis. But certainly I understand that the point, and I agree with that there's a lot of different kind of attributes of a messenger that might influence perception. It looked like you had something you wanted to say on that one.
No, I'm sorry,
I gave you a headache. The framework was too long.
Sorry.
I wanted to expand on Ken's point a little bit as I was going through and I was thinking, one of the challenges we face now is sort of, okay, where do we research? And I think certainly early on, we kind of go through this list and we talk to the program agencies and we say, there may be some things in here that are really low cost, almost zero cost, but have a significant effect. And those are the things we kind of go in there looking for, going down the behavioral list. But as we realize we have really scarce resource dollars and the time and the coordination it takes to do these, those aren't necessarily the things we actually really want to research, right? If there's something that's almost zero cost, and we're pretty sure it has a zero or a positive effect for the program, the program agency should probably just be doing it, right? So we really want to test things that have some sort of downside. And so either there's a significant cost to implementing it, so you might not want to do it, or the effect might be positive or negative. So like the Banerjee paper, right, where providing information might actually make program outcomes worse. And so those are the things where I think we really want to kind of focus research going forward, particularly when we're working with the program agencies. Like for some of this other stuff where we can extrapolate from other literature, we almost want to say, there's not a good reason not to be using some of these social norms in their literature. And if you look at their existing literature, they are already to some extent, maybe not as much as, and as forcefully as a way as we think maybe they should, but.
That's a great point. And so part of what I really like about this discussion is I'm thinking about how we could kind of adjust this paper and make some revisions in order to be more, not just presenting a framework, but thinking about a path moving forward. So many of these comments have, really made me start thinking about that. So somehow incorporating the cost and thinking about a trade-off that would have to be made, I think could be another thing that would be useful and warrant discussion in this type of review. So yeah, definitely appreciate the point.
Yeah, I think that's really important because downstairs right now, there are all the program leaders for NIFA talking about the various areas of research they think they need to deal with it. And there's also a lot of how do we get X, Y, and Z to do things? Oh, education or extension. I mean, the answer is education and extension to literally everything: soil health, climate change, nutrition, food safety, you name it. And I don't think that's right. So I think it's these other kind of mechanisms that aren't being exploited sufficiently or that they're not aware of in some of these other program agencies besides. I'm sure you've completely convinced FSA and the right thing to do, but Food Nutrition Service. There's a lot of other areas where the default is education and extension.
But that is, although it's not in that mind space framework, this idea that people have imperfect information, it's just that's the solution, and there's no tests, right? Rarely do they actually test when that information leads to behavioral change, which is a serious gap, because every project does have dissemination, education, information transfer, and no one's actually verifying that it makes a difference in terms of outcomes.
And in a slightly different context, anxiety about GMOs or acceptance of some kind of technological change. There's this knowledge deficit perspective that we need to tell them part of this thing. These tools.
But, I mean, so they would argue back, and that's where, like, those are also the places, I think, for these sorts of interventions, when there's just an unresolvable debate, where people have either their theories or their anecdotes saying, I think it's gonna work, I don't think it's gonna work. That's where we should be running some experiments to see who's right. And also, that provides some insights to these underlying behavioral models. Is it really, that it's information that's the binding constraint, or persuasion? They need to see another side of the debate that will change their opinion.
They need to be a part of it. It needs to be democratic.
Right. We did that with this project on the climate change group. That the first debate we had is, can we even mention climate change to farmers? We couldn't get over that. One group said, well, if we're just saying the things we're already saying, then we're just doing what we're already doing. There's nothing new. The other group says, if you say climate change or greenhouse gas emissions, you turn farmers off. Like, then we got everybody agreeable. Let's run an experiment and see, does it matter? In that case, it didn't seem to matter. But, more of that would be beneficial to resolve some of these debates that seem just perennially going around.
Well, and on that messenger piece, like even the same message, depending on who it comes from, has been shown to matter as well. Maybe extension people are often the best people to deliver messages because there is that kind of relationship trust, but not always. Sometimes the
Trust is really key.
Yeah.
Yes, so since we're throwing out all sorts of different directions that you can go with this.
Yeah, go for it.
Switching gears entirely and thinking about what might be valuable from an academic researcher perspective is you are running the gamut from lab to field, pulling apart that dimension of your findings and talking about how important is context validity when you're talking about stuff that you want to generalize for agro-environmental programs. Does it really matter that you are running something in the field, farmers are unaware of it? Does it matter if you're talking about a result from a student experiment and how that's going to play out forward? In which context is this really critical, and for kind of what issue does it seem to really matter about matching up context validity very carefully? If that's something that maybe it doesn't fit in this paper, maybe it's something to look at further down the line, but if you're going to compare studies where you talk about, doing the wine study, I think is really fun. But whether talking about decisions about bottles of wine translates to how people believe about a larger cost environmental issue, like pollution in the Gulf of Mexico, or something like that. That's a big and a really important question. Is that leap okay?
To do that, you have to expand the scope. We've already talked about that a bunch of times, because 14 papers is great. So, the angle for expanding could be, well, what's different about agri-environmental that you can't depend on the rest of the behavioral literature? First one is producers, who this is their operations, their businesses. They're not people making retirement decisions or vaccination or charitable giving. And the other is the pure public good nature of what we're doing. There's private and public benefits. Retirement account is basically private. Vaccination, there has a little bit of that, but maybe bringing in studies that have those attributes, and then maybe you can look a little more at context validity or lab versus field. But you're not going to do it. Even that study I presented a few weeks ago on framing incentives as losses versus gains, we had about 16 studies, and there seems to be field experiments get much smaller effect sizes than the lab, but there still wasn't enough for us to be enough studies to be able to say that. So I think it's important those sorts of things. We'll have to bring in more studies to be able to say something.
Yeah, there's a general trend between lab and field, but part of the issue could be that in the lab, people are often working with a very nebulous concept, and that we assume, like risk experiment that I'm running, I'm doing something to mimic crop insurance that has absolutely nothing on the surface that looks.
Right, no, for context, the construct validity itself is, I agree. So you go either way. We lab versus, I was giving that as an example, but I think you're right. That's another opportunity. With 14, but even the 14, I don't know how good high construct validity, like the wine thing, which So, but, you know, if you expanded it so that you allowed for other studies, then you might be able to get at that. There'd be lab studies on social comparisons and field experiments for energy, water that have this pure public good aspect. They're consumers, not producers, but you might still be able to get at that. That might be an easier angle to get at than some of the, like, you know, lab versus field differences, because then you have problems. There's not enough of those bins that have both to be able to control that. There might be for this other stuff. I mean, just producers versus consumers, I think, is a big one that's not clear. There's not enough, that if you expand the scope, you might have a little more to say on that. But, you know, just a few, like CRP, the opioid thing that the behavior group, these social comparisons don't seem to affect business. Like businesses say, I don't care what other people are doing, I'm doing what's best for me. But there's, you know, 2 or 3 studies, that's not really sufficient to make a claim.
One thing that I hope you're gonna do at the end of this paper is put out a really nice targeted research agenda. Prioritize what you think would be the most useful things to tackle as far as holes in this space.
Yeah, stealing Steve's idea would be good. We'll give him a little 7.5 acknowledgement.
Yeah, I think that would.
I think
We're good on the webinar? Yep.
Okay, well, yeah, I think we'll end the formal part, but can you?
One little thing. This Paul talk and this talk will be on the CBEAR website.